to the breakfast show here on Faith FM. And we are going to have Sam Bonello, our financial advisor expert here. He's going to have a conversation with us about negative gearing. Lawson, do you know what negative gearing is?
Mate, we're going to be talking about the housing market.
We're going to be talking about the housing market today. Good morning to you, Sam. Happy to have you here.
Good morning.
Sam, I actually want to ask you a question because it looks like there is a big push around against that thing that is called negative gearing in the housing markets. Just let me ask you one thing. I'm hearing a little bit of an echo in the line. Do you have your phone on speaker or something like that? If you could just bring it to normal voice.
No, I've just got it on normal voice.
Okay, I think that's it got better now. And so there is actually a news here that just came yesterday, Sam, from the Australian Council of Social Services. They have joined their voices in asking the government to knock back negative gearing altogether and also to phase out the capital gains tax discount when selling a property. And their argument is that, hey, the government is missing out on a lot of revenue here that could be used to help the housing market to grow and to have a boost there. So I actually want to ask you, what is negative gearing and what's the fuss about it?
Yeah, so negative gearing is the practice of investors borrowing money to buy a property, and they create a situation where the rental income is less than the expenses of holding the property. So the maintenance of the property, the rates, the loan interest, and it allows the investor to deduct those expenses and create a loss. So their investment is not making the money, it's costing them money, and that brings down the amount of tax that they have to pay.
I see.
So the reason people do this is to control an asset so that the capital growth that asset experiences, they get to benefit from. And it's a bet that over time that asset will become more valuable to the extent that it offsets the losses that they've made along the way.
I see. And so what is the connection with that? What else can you say about that topic of negative gearing and its connection with the housing market? What are some of the insights? Do you think that it is a problem for Australia at the moment? What's your 2 cents?
Look, here's my 2 cents on it. It's more of a political issue than a financial issue. And here's why I say that. The Australian government federally spends $715 billion per year. That's their budget. The money that taxpayers lose through capital gains, the capital negative gearing system, is $3.5 billion in the 23-24 financial year. So it's less than 0.5% of the federal budget is being lost to the investors that are getting the benefits from negative gearing. That's not significant. And I think a lot of the sentiment from those calling for the cancellation altogether of negative gearing is this perception that the rich people are benefiting from negative gearing and it's pushing up the house prices. Immigration is pushing up house prices almost as much, but no one's talking about that as much. Things like the diesel fuel credits, which large mining companies get a lot of benefit from, that costs the Australian taxpayer just under $11 million. So if there was significant interest in really making a difference to the federal budget, we wouldn't be talking about negative gearing at $3.5 billion benefit to the taxpayer. We'd be talking about things like fuel credits for large mining companies. And
sorry, how much did you say? 11 billion? $11 billion?
$11 billion for the just $10.8 billion in tax costs for the diesel credits. A lot of that goes to the big mining companies, whereas negative gearing benefits for investors add up to about $3.5 billion. And here's the thing that I think a lot of people calling for its cancellation don't realize. About 70% of the investors that benefit from negative gearing are teachers, nurses, people that are earning under $100,000 a year. So if you cancel negative gearing altogether, it doesn't just penalise the ultra wealthy, because the number of people in Australia that have more than one investment property is less than 30%. So most people that are going to be affected are regular, not blue collar, but also sort of service industry workers that are trying to provide for their own retirement by having an investment property that's growing for them. And if people succeed in becoming self-funded retirees through having one investment property, that's going to save the taxpayer a lot more than if those people end up on the age pension for the duration of their retirement.
So there is a positive
I think it's a little bit short-sighted, and I think it's a very political issue rather than a financial issue.
What about so what you're saying here is that when these everyday teachers, nurses, people that manage to be able to save enough to purchase a property, an investment property,
yep,
because that is ended up going to become their source for pension, for retirement in the future, that will translate into less pension from
less taxpayer money in age pension going to those retirees.
So it will even out over time.
Yeah, look, I think, like I say, I think it's short-sighted to say, let's take away the negative gearing altogether. I think a sensible reform to it might be you're only allowed to claim negative gearing deductions on your first investment property.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got 2, 3, 4 investment properties, which it's actually a very small number of Australians have more than one property, more than one investment property, that sort of carves out a benefit for people that are just getting started with their first property, but doesn't let people that have got multiple properties sort of laugh at the tax system and the taxpayer.
And what caused the government to start with to legislate or to introduce that concept of negative gearing in the first place? Do you know a little bit about the history? What were the government trying to achieve by offering that those tax exemptions?
Yeah, I didn't brush up on the origin of it, but essentially, an investor takes a risk in purchasing a property and being a landlord. The hope, I think, was that by offering negative gearing, it would incentivize investors to build more properties.
Okay, yes, that makes sense.
It hasn't really worked out that way because the majority of properties that people claim negative gearing on are established properties, and that's where the argument comes from, that it's pushing up the price of housing, and it makes it difficult for first home buyers to get into the market. But a much more significant obstacle to getting into the market is not that some investors are able to claim negative gearing tax deductions. It's that we've got to pay 4% roughly stamp duty on the purchase. So if the government's trying to solve the housing affordability crisis and the ability for young people or first home buyers to get into the market, I think a review of stamp duty at the state level will move the needle more than cancelling negative gearing altogether.
Yes, well, there's definitely a lot of moving parts that can be looked at. And as you mentioned, the negative gearing got the bad press, but that it's not necessarily the most effective solution to help out in the housing crisis.
Honestly, it's a drop in the bucket. It really is a drop in the bucket. And I think, there's a rhetoric around it that the rich are taking the taxpayer for a ride and claiming all these deductions, but 70% of the people claiming negative gearing tax deductions earn less than $100,000 a year. So it's a popular thing. What I find frustrating, discouraging, is that there's been a few politicians that have run on cancelling negative gearing altogether, although even the current government has said that they won't do it. But nobody's run on other measures like cancelling the fuel credits for large miners, or working out some other irregularities in the tax system that really have a lot of lobbying money behind them.
Absolutely. And Sam, so let's just change a little bit, because certainly there are factors that are outside of the control of our listeners. But what would be your advice, like general advice to perhaps a young person that is questioning if they ever would be able to purchase a property or buy a house in Australia in the current environment? What do you say to them?
Yeah, for those that are really finding it hard, I think they're probably looking in their backyard. If they broaden their view to this concept that we've spoken of before, Joseph, of being a rent investor, where they rent where they have to live in order for work or family or the lifestyle that they want, but they buy an investment property in an area. They might be living in Sydney, but they can afford a unit on the Gold Coast or in Adelaide, and that investment property that is a long way from where they live is their stepping stone in the property market. So they're enjoying some of the capital growth of the property market, which roughly doubles every 10 years. Then I think that is a really sensible consideration for people to look at, is being a rent investor.
So
where they own an investment
property
properties
elsewhere where prices are not as high. And what about joining in? Like, is it something that has to be done by yourself, or can you join, or is it too risky to grab a couple of good mates and say, hey, why don't we do this together? So it's not as steep.
Yeah, good question. There's a few sort of tech solutions or investment solutions that are coming up where you can buy sort of part of a house in the same way that you can buy, shares. Those have some merit, but you can't borrow to get into those, and that's the real power of property investing, is leverage. I generally advise against going into property, even with your siblings, even with, your best mate. Someone gets injured at work, they can't pay their share of the mortgage, it all falls apart. Someone falls in love, they want to live in the place on their own, you've got to buy them out, you don't have the money to buy out their share. The transaction costs with property are so high that you don't ever want to be forced to sell because something changes in your relationship with your co-investor. And that's where I think the rent vesting idea is better. If you've only got a small deposit, then go to a buyer's agent that's borderless and will look anywhere in the country and help you find a cash flow positive property in an area where you can afford the deposit.
Wow. That makes it look. That's good to know, because I did hear around on media people saying, hey, there's people buying with their mates and so on, but there's certainly some risks.
I think it's just fraught with danger for sure. And the resource that I would direct listeners to is go to a podcast called The Property Couch, and go on your computer at home and just search rent vesting. And there'll be a dozen odd podcasts there about rent vesting. They've got some great stories, testimonies of people that have gone from really nothing to having a healthy little property portfolio, and they've started by rent vesting. So definitely encourage people to go and check out the Property Couch podcast.
Absolutely. And as a Christian financial advisor as well, like, is there any sort of a Bible principle that underpins this whole idea of rent vesting and looking at properties, or what comes to your mind when you think about God's counsels on these matters?
Yeah, I think generally, we're given talents that God asks us to be faithful with and to be proactive with. And one of those talents, certainly not the only talent, is our finances. Timothy says that if we don't provide for our families, we're worse than unbelievers, and certainly having a property investment is one way of growing your wealth and being able to provide for your family rather than relying on, social security systems like the age pension or other things in later life. So I think generally there's a lot of counsel that we should be proactive without compromising our tithe and our offering and our generosity. That's something that God calls us to first, but I think we can do both. look after our family, be proactive with our finances, and never compromise our generosity and our faithfulness in other areas of finance.
Sam Bonello, thank you so much. And if you'd like to check out the podcast that Sam and I started, it's called The 2 Cents Podcast. It's available on faithfm.com.au, and we talk about all things finance for beginners.